And happy Sunday. It is 2 p.m. on the East Coast. In Newfoundland, it's 3:30. This is PFG Live. Welcome aboard. I hope you guys are having a great Sunday so far. We have a great lineup today. Coming up later will be our guest, Adam Demuth, and we'll be talking about things grinding and reporting on previous news. Who do we have? Carl, welcome aboard. Carl reports 66 degrees in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. Welcome, Carl. And Tuck is here. Tuck, can we get a weather report from you? I mean, I know it's, oh, there it is, 70 degrees and sunny in Buffalo, New York. Nice to see you. Who else do we have here? Evils, welcome, sir, from Belgium. 24C and 57% relative humidity in Ghent, Belgium. Blake is here. 76 Fahrenheit and sunny in Rochester, New York. Boy, that corner of New York is getting well represented. CJ Stevens, welcome, sir. 84 and sunny in beautiful East Tennessee. Test Room 2003, welcome. From the Netherlands, let's see if I can pronounce the name of your town. Oostkapelle, Netherlands. Welcome. 18.5 C, 86% relative humidity, dark and lightly clouded. Art that makes art, Wes. Welcome aboard. 47 degrees. 47 degrees and 100% humidity. It's raining. Carl is here. All rise. Be seated. Please explain the code on the screen under the time. I will. I promise. And of course, Wes says South Central Idaho, where the onions and the potatoes live in peaceful harmony. Unix Carbide in the Brooklyn of New York is reporting 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 64.42% relative humidity indoors. Listen to that again, folks. 64% relative humidity indoors. Ike went through some serious flooding in Brooklyn because of these recent weather conditions. So let's all bring our desiccants to his place. Paul checks in. He is in the garage with the door open in Dallas. Tells you everything you need to know. Wonderful. Almost Machining is almost here. 78 degrees Fahrenheit and in the Phoenix of Arizona, which means it's 0% relative humidity. Robert Simpson is here. 74 and 70% relative humidity in sunny north of Detroit, the sunny of the north. Welcome. Okay, so if you look up at that little code up there, everybody's wondering what that is. That is known as an aviation METAR, which stands for meteorological something. But they basically, in aviation, that's what would print out on your teletype machine in the old days, and that's called a station report. So it says KMHT, that's the name of the airport. In this case, it's Manchester, New Hampshire Airport. Then it says 011753 Zulu. So it's the 01 is the date. That's the 1st of October. That's today. 1753 Zulu. That's the time of the report. So that was a few minutes ago. It says 34006. That's winds are 340 degrees at 6 knots, which means if you were flying 340 degrees, it would be right on your nose, okay? 6 knots. 7 statute miles is the visibility. So one of the interesting pieces of trivia is that the visibility is given in statute miles. Everything else is given in nautical miles. CLR means clear. So the sky is clear, and I can confirm that it is clear. Temperature 25/dew point 12. Nice and dry. Altimeter 3014. That's 30.14 inches of mercury. That's what you set on your altimeter in the aircraft. And then RMK means remarks. So after that, everything could be a whole bunch of stuff, which I won't get into. But that's what it says. That's how we read weather in aviation speak. Let's see. We got everybody who checked in, so that's good. A few minor updates. So I owe everybody the Ford F-150 Lightning report. My electric truck has been awesome. We're coming up on 10,000 miles, which means it's going up for its 10,000 mile checkup. And the maintenance schedule on the vehicle is pretty simple. It's like we want to see it every 10,000 miles, and then you go in for the maintenance and they grease a few fittings and send you home, because they already know all about your vehicle because it's on the network and they've been talking to it the whole time. So literally it's $100, you're in, you're out, you're done. And I'm heading up to do that. It has been a fantastic vehicle. Everything has been great. Adrian is here. 19 degrees Celsius and 19-mile visibility, scattered clouds and light winds in Surrey, the UK. Welcome. Greetings from Hamilton Pianos. Oh, okay. Did your Swiss arrive yet? Yeah. So Adrian and I had a little chat about getting a Swiss lathe. And actually, we're going to pick on Adam when he shows up. And maybe we'll get him to buy a Swiss lathe. What do you think? We'll see if we can make that happen. So getting back to the truck, fantastic experience. Have there been technical issues? Yes. And one of the things that I had to go for a visit was it wasn't getting updates properly. So I went up there and my guy took care of me, and at the Ford dealership, which is Grapponi Ford up in Bow, New Hampshire. And he manually hooked up to the truck and updated every module and got everything up to date. And I think the biggest challenge with the system and Ford in general has been software-y things and network connection-y things. Those have been the problems. From a mechanical point of view, everything's been superb, and I've been really enjoying it. So that's the super brief 10,000 mile report on the Ford Lightning. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Let's see. That's the major thing on the Lightning. It's been hauling stuff and hauling people, and just been a joy. One of the most surprising things has been how nice it is in rush hour. So I had to come back home from seeing my mom in Boston rush hour. And because the cruise control, the Blue Cruise, will actually do complete hands-off, and because it'll go down to 0 miles an hour in that mode, it's actually pretty relaxing, and you're not as stressed and, angry in traffic as one would otherwise normally be. So it's been a pleasure. So there you go. There's your Lightning report. The second thing I want to report on is our humidity sensor. We've been playing around. If you've been following, let me show you the latest data. Our Adafruit Feather and our SHT4x temperature and humidity sensor has been clicking along, and we're now in the midst of a battery life test. So once per hour, this thing wakes up, it gets on the internet, it updates its time, it reads the sensor, it posts the data to this Notify site, and it goes back to deep sleep and preserves its battery power. So it does this once an hour, and so far it's doing pretty well. We had one crash. We understand why. It's your connection almost. I think everybody else is good. Is everybody's audio good? If anybody has a problem, let me know. Does the lightning indicate mileage per megajoule? Actually, it measures in, let me see if I remember. There is a measurement. There's a figure of merit, and I can't remember what it is. And it does give you that score. And a typical score is, it's miles per kilowatt hour. That's what it is. Miles per kilowatt hour. And like I get 2.2 miles per kilowatt hour typically. So back to our temperature humidity sensor, you see where on your screen, if you're on the audio podcast, I'll read it for you. It says our battery is at 86.5%, temperature 72.5 Fahrenheit, and relative humidity 56.2%. So this was taken at 1:45. That was half an hour ago. And I'll point out that we started this experiment on Thursday, the 28th of September. Today's October 1st at 8 p.m. So this thing's been running for days and doing a great job. Hey, Machine New Zealand is here. Welcome aboard, sir. Are you at work or about to get to work? So Machine NZ is at the antipode almost and is checking in. But they just had a time change. So I don't know if you knew this, but New Zealand changes its clocks at the equinox, which is not when we change our clocks. So if you have to know what time it is in New Zealand, use an app. That's all I'm going to say about that. So stay tuned on our Adafruit, feather, and relative humidity measurements. And we'll keep you informed, but this has been a wild success, and I think we're on the road to something that you can charge and then ignore for a few months, and I think that is going to be super cool. Let's see, Machine New Zealand is at work, so you just nod your head. You don't have to like type into your phone or anything. You just stick in here with us. So that's the update on the Adafruit experiments and the Sensorion sensor experiments. If you want to play with that stuff, on the links page, pfg.gg/links, there's another link that says the quest for dry filament. And all of our relative humidity measurements and sensors and stuff, I'm putting that all in that spot. So we're sharing all the 3D prints. We're sharing, we will be sharing the software. We're a little behind on that. We have a GitHub account where we're publishing the software, and you can join in on the fun as you wish. Let's see. One more thing I want to cover, and then we're going to get to our much anticipated guest, and that is that Unix Carbide, Ike, has offered to teach a course in the use of Git and GitHub. Now, this is a software versioning system. Oh, hey, Chris just checked in. Chris says, greetings, Earthlings, 77 degrees and sunny in south central Pennsylvania. The rain appears to have stopped. Yeah, some places it stopped. It stopped here. So Git and GitHub is a way to do software versioning and software sharing and publishing and collaboration. Very important to software developers, and there's been some interest in that. So we've set a date, and I'm going to give you that information right now. Let's see. Next week. Where am I? Here we go. October 5th, Thursday, at 7 p.m. on the Discord server. That's our plan for running our Git course, okay? So if you're interested in that, you got two things you got to do. Number one, get on our Discord server. You have time to figure that out. And number two, the event will be on the on the Discord server. So it'll kind of be like a Zoom meeting. It's going to be, a chat, and we'll be learning something from Ike. So it'll be pretty cool. Let's see. Iron Forest Knives has checked in. He says hello from Oklahoma City. 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 33% relative humidity. Yow, that's a little warm. Almost, who's in Phoenix, says, rain only comes out of the end of a garden hose here. I get it. Joel L. is late. Listen, buddy, if you're late again, absolutely nothing is going to happen. Welcome. Okay, so that's the Git course. Thursday night, 7 p.m. on our Discord server. Be there or be square. Joel says he'll be there for the GitHub course. It's got a U in it, but we won't hold that against you. Unix is confirming October 5th, 7 p.m. is the target, covering Git use fundamentals and using the GitHub universe. Ooh. Excellent. All right. If there's any other questions on that stuff, let me know. Otherwise, I think we're going to bring in our guest, Adam Demuth. So please stand by. Hey, look. It's Adam. Oh, wait. There, your audio's on now. Hi, Adam.
How's it going?
It's going great. Nice to have you here, sir. So today's topic is grinder workflow. And I'd like to read you a letter we got. This is what prompted this whole thing. I received a letter in the mail from he wants to remain anonymous, so I'm just going to use a pseudonym. This is from Jim Sanders of Sanders Machine Place in Zanesville, Ohio. And Jim Sanders says, I'm not sure if I can use my hand to wipe off the chuck after I use my most beloved PFG Stones. He says, I'm worried that my skin cells might be left on the chuck and cause a dimensional inaccuracy. Please enlighten me, as I just bought a new grinder and I'm really trying to learn how to use it well. Sincerely, Jim Sanders, who may or may not have a YouTube channel. And here's his letter.
All right.
Just so you know, I'm not making this up. Or maybe I am making this up. Actually, he did have that question. Of course, I'm talking about John Saunders. And he wanted to know, do I stone? Do I wipe? Can I use my hand? So we don't have to answer that first, but we do have to answer that, or else we will not get paid for this episode. So what are your thoughts on workflow? I mean, I know I have a pretty standardized checklist and ways of doing things, but how about you? Do you have is it built in, or do you have a conscious checklist?
I can't really abide to a rigid system, because if you're doing like large plates on the magnet, that's going to need kind of a different treatment than feeding, parts this big into a fixture. You have to approach those situations individually. That being said, to kind of like cut to the chase, usually like the last thing to touch the magnet and the last thing to touch the part should be the stone. But it's just like years of muscle memory. Anytime I set something on the grinder, I'm inclined to do that. And it's just a really hard habit to break. But I don't know that it's affecting anything. Because if you ever run your finger across a ground surface, like even what we consider a good ground surface, like 16 to 32 microinch, it catches your fingernail. There's actually a fair bit of topography there, peaks and valleys. And so I think as long as the debris getting left behind from when you wipe your hand fits in those peaks and valley gaps, you're okay.
So I know that when we use gauge blocks, a lot of the conventional wisdom has always been, wipe the gauge block on a, there's all sorts of opinions about where to pick up the right amount of skin oil. So that would seem to indicate that, wiping with your hands is not the end of the world.
No, and that's kind of where my head took me. But I will say in practice, if I have a day where I'm doing like a lot of turnovers on my grinding chuck, parts going on and off and all day long, your hands show that. You have like kind of dried cake grit and coolant on, and I take efforts to keep them clean, but I could also see, maybe picking up a piece of abrasive grit or swarf off your hand. But that kind of highlights the need to have like a developed sense of feel when you're seating the part. Most of the people who I considered to be peers in grinding, a lot of their talent was just sense. And I think a lot of people get annoyed from that from a process design standpoint. They want to have parameters and processes, and sense is just not something fun to incorporate into something like that. But I think you could do it correctly. But yeah, you do need to know what a part that has a very fine speck of grit under it feels like. That's part of working on a magnet.
Do you slide parts on from the edge of the magnet? That's question. I have two questions.
Not from the edge.
Okay.
I corner down on the magnet and then give it a little scooch. I find like on my grinding chuck, the edge usually has like a lot of crud on it.
Yeah.
And so I just try to avoid that. So
I find myself using my hands a lot, and I have no problem. I never worried about what I was depositing on the chuck, and I don't think I'm going to start worrying now. My opinion is that you have these sensors, right? You got this magnificent sensor tool, and the whole idea is not only are you potentially wiping off some grit, but you're also feeling it.
Correct.
And that's pretty cool. Although, like you said, the last thing that should touch the chuck is the stone. I still tend to wipe with my hand after the stone, but I guess we could have a religious argument about that.
Yeah. It's like a very deep, long running habit that I have. And, honestly, it's not been a problem yet. And so I don't beat myself up too much for doing it. But
let's back up like way back. Okay. Because workflow starts way before you're dropping work on a chuck. So
yep.
let's take the process from the very beginning, and we can share sort of what we do. First of all, for everybody who may or may not know you from the intertubes, why don't you give your channel name on YouTube? I think that's where most people can find you. Is there any other social media that you're doing?
No,
right
I don't
now?
really do much on Instagram anymore.
Okay.
I don't know. I just kind of don't get much from it these days.
So
but yeah, it's this name right here in YouTube.
Okay, so Adam the Machinist, all one word.
Yep.
On YouTube. And we'll link to that in the information on this YouTube video. And you do an excellent job of teaching and explaining, and I appreciate it. I look forward to your videos.
No problem.
So you wake up on a Monday and you have grinding to do. How does your checklist start?
Coffee.
Yes.
And then I get the machine in warm-up mode. And this machine my CNC one has a pretty quick plateau. Because I keep the coolant heated over winter. It's not something I have to mess with in like the warmer months, but now the heater's back in the tank. it more or less hits its plateau in about 15 minutes. And so while that's happening, I'm kind of laying out my work for the day. So I have generally, when I'm doing grinding, it's either a lot of one shape or a lot of all different shapes. And so I'm kind of trying to make my game plan. Like, am I doing 20 of the same thing? What's the best way to do that? Or I have 20 unique parts. Are there any commonalities? Like, maybe one's 1/2 inch by 3/4 by 4, and another is 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch by 3. Can I do those 1/2 inch dimensions at the same time? And so I'm looking for common threads amongst odd parts. And so that's what I'm doing while the grinder's warming up, is just kind of getting a game plan.
And you have you said you have a 15-minute warm up?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I'm running coolant on the chuck and the table while the wheel's warming up, and then the table's reciprocating. So everything's warmed up, squeegee off the table. I like it dry. I find stoning the table with even just a little bit of residual moisture, it sucks the stone down, and you don't know if you're fighting like a high spot.
Yeah, you lose
just like a suction.
You lose the feel.
And so one of the things I do to like speed up that drying time, because even if you squeegee and towel it off, you still have to like let it flash off a little. But I find a little squirt of IPA usually acts as a dryer and gets any, maybe you have like a little high oil content in your oil or in your coolant, and it'll also kind of wipe off some of that. So once the chuck's cleaned and dried, I give it a light stoning and mount my first part.
So we have a lot of commonalities here. I have a 30-minute warm-up cycle, just because that's how I set up the machine. And I do not run my coolant during that time. Interestingly.
What's the reasoning?
I don't think I have reasoning. I do my thermal conditioning in the tank because I also have the heater, right? So I bring the heater. I have it set to 68 Fahrenheit. I have the room set to 68 Fahrenheit. And there's arguments that could be made that might not be the ideal numbers. But again, I have to consider the dimensional requirements of what I'm doing. And I don't have tight dimensions I'm holding flat most of the time. And I also, so you talked about dry and doing the last wipe with a solvent. So I clean the chuck with, I use denatured alcohol typically in the shop. And I'll do a wipe down also with denatured alcohol, and then I'll go in with I have the 6-inch stones that I use for the chuck, because I'm working on, what size chuck are you working on?
6x12.
Okay, so I'm working on a 6x18. Same thing. I'll stone the chuck, and that kind of brings me to zero, kind of where you're at. Tell everybody what type of grinder you're running. I think most people know that have listened to us for a while.
I run 2 Parker Majestics, so that one's a CNC, and then that one's a manual.
Excellent. And for the warm-up cycle on the manual, do you stand there for half an hour and turn the knobs?
I do not.
No. Yeah, the discovery of the fish tank heater, the 800-watt aquarium heater, was a huge win. What do you set yours to in the winter?
So normally I would go to 68, and that's what I did for like the first year I had it. But I found you still get about a degree or two of ramp up from using the coolant. And believe it or not, some of that's pumping heat, not just the cooling of the cutting action, like the pump's actually heating. And I had to put a data logger on it to like really understand what was heating things. And so I find just going to like 67 kind of averages off that 2-degree ramp up a little, and you're still within a degree of 68 then, instead of going from 68 to 70.
Let's talk.
And then
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, then my air's held at 68.
So, let's talk a little bit about the temperatures. Have you looked at temperatures of your column, for example? I think you did some temperature logging a while back.
Yeah, I was concerned about spindle heat, but the way they have that machine set up, spindle heat really doesn't get into the column too bad. I was pleased to see that. Not spindle, I guess, but motor heat. And then my other concern was performance of the ball screw for the elevating axis. Is that going to have issues with heat?
Mm-hmm.
But they did something pretty clever by mounting the servo to the bottom of the column. It handles growth better, because as the column stretches, as it gets hotter and colder, the static point being at the bottom means the wheel head isn't on a ride with the column as the column gets hotter and colder. So I would say thermally that the machine's extremely stable, and just keeping everything as near 20C as possible helps that tremendously.
We do have some questions coming in. Chuck's Garage says, how do you get thin plates off the mag chuck without sliding?
So let me find a thin plate. So one of the reasons I run a 12-inch chuck on a grinder that has 18 inches of travel is I have the chuck all the way to one side, and then I kind of have a dead space on the other end of the travel, and then my dresser. But I can, if I have something I'm really worried about getting off the table, usually almost all my parts have holes, and so a punch of the appropriate size, you stick in the hole and kind of like give it a pry, and that's one way. But often what I'll do is in that dead space, just hang the part off the grinding chuck an eighth an inch, and then you can just take like a brass drift and pop it. Or one of the most common tools I use for getting parts off the chuck, I have a set of the Knipex parallel jaw pliers.
Yep.
And I really like those for like clamping on and then just pop it again.
I also use the Knipex parallel jaw wrenches. They're perfect. Excellent.
But, yeah.
Evils asks. So Evils says, he's an aquarist. Have you ever heard that word? I
have not.
I believe that means an aquarium enthusiast.
I thought it was like a zodiac sign.
It might have been. We're going to start singing. If overheating is as big a problem as it is in an aquarium, don't rely on the built-in bimetallic strip thermostat. I am also an aquarium. Okay, so I think, and he says he's also an Aquarius, by the way. Though I believe I'm speaking for you also, so if I'm wrong, correct me. But the units we got have a separate, solid state probe in the tank, digital readout kind of thing. So we're definitely not in the bimetallic strip department. Don't worry about that. And one question I had about, and a related question from YouTube, Carl says, do you use mechanical agitation in the coolant tank or rely on convection? I rely on convection.
Convection, and mine has weirs in it, which I find to be effective in a grinding tank. Like even with the filter, there still gets a little bit of particulate. Most of it settles in that first weir column.
Yeah.
And so my concern was I have the heater on the second weir where the pump is, and it's the bigger of the two two areas of the tank. My concern was that the first stage would be cold in the morning. And and that's part of the running the coolant as I warm it up, is to like kind of cycle shift the cold coolant into the hot heated area. But I honestly think once you have, I mean, it's a 22-gallon tank, let's say 15 of it is heated, I think you get enough of that mass in a metal tank, it's probably keeping the other half warm enough.
Yeah, your tank has the weirs, and my tank does not, which means from my standpoint, your tank is weird. Am I wrong?
Sure.
Okay. Moving on. My tank does not have weirs. My old one did. My Brown and Sharp did. So I don't think much about that. But no, I just throw it in. The pumping action of the coolant takes care of any concerns about what's the word I'm looking for? Gradient, temperature gradient. Here's a question. Homogeneity.
There we go. Yeah.
We'll go with that. So, my question for you is magnetic chuck. Magnetic chucks generate electrically operated electromagnetic chucks. There we go. Generate heat. My chuck generates heat, and sometimes when I'm working with little things, I'll have to crank the. Let me clarify that. I have some pieces that I use for work holding of non-magnetic substances. I'll leave that as an exercise to the student, that are relatively small in surface area. So I crank the current up on my magnetic chuck. This in turn does cause heating in the chuck. Do you think about, well, A, are you using electromagnetic chucks or permanent magnet chucks? And B, how does this affect your thoughts about therms? And before you answer, please just keep in mind that K-Bonk reports 78 degrees and sunny in Philadelphia. Please continue.
I do not use electric chucks. I can make a permanent manual chuck do whatever I need it to do. Like if I need a fine pool chuck, I just set this on top of my manual chuck. And if I need less magnetism, I have standoffs. It's never been worth the risk or the not risk, I guess, but electric chucks are not without drama. They have a time life to them. There's the heat element. I've found because they heat up, there's more opportunity for coolant to get under them than, say, a permanent manual chuck. So that being said, if you must, if you look at like companies that do incredibly high precision grinding, they're cooling their chucks. They have nozzles running down the length of the table, shooting onto the chuck. And that's something they take pretty seriously. The chuck, or maybe they're grinding a part elevated from the chuck. They're also cooling the underside of the part. But those are usually very long grinders where that heating action of the electric chuck is going to be significantly more of a problem. On a 18-inch chuck, you might be fighting a tenth or two over the day, whereas they might be fighting 5/10 over a day. So,
and that's a big fight. So lots of coolant. I use tons of coolant. If you watch my grinding process, that sucker is blasting coolant, and I have lots of shielding, and gallons per hour. I haven't calculated it, but I use a lot. Are you in the mega flood camp, or are you being kind of?
If I'm going to go through the trouble of having to clean my chuck, dry it every time I put on a part, I'm going to get the full benefit. And so if you're running any coolant, you might as well run like as much as possible. Otherwise, I'm just going to grind dry, which I do occasionally do. I find if I'm feeding individual parts into a fixture for a very fast, like sub 1 minute operation, I'll adjust my parameters down till it allows me to grind it dry. But then I can go significantly quicker on the part changeover, not having to deal with coolant. So
That's
yeah,
a very
dry grinding has some versatility to it, I guess, if you can make it work.
I think that's brilliant. You just pointed out a trade-off you can make: time spent dealing with coolant versus time spent, staying on your parts.
Yeah, people underestimate changeover time on grinding work. I don't often do a lot of generic mill this flat and parallel or grind this flat and parallel type work. I have one guy who I kind of like. He mills some parts, sends them to me, and I just take them to final thickness, both sides. But the time it takes to load the chuck with parts is longer than the time it takes to grind the chuck worth of parts. And so basically on a small chuck, you can never get away from the machine. You're always cleaning and wiping off stuff. So, but back to my workflow, we mounted our part after the warm up and initial stoning of the chuck. We grind it, and now we're ready to flip and grind the opposite side. And this is really important. Back to cleanliness. If your part has like threaded holes in it, like most the world's parts do, you have to get those impeccably clean. And so I think it's really important if you're running coolant, you need to have some kind of coolant squirt gun setup on your machine, ready to go, plumbed at all times. I see a lot of manufacturers have some sort of system where when you want to wash down the machine, you disconnect the hose from the spraying nozzle for the wheel and mount a water pistol. It really needs to be plumbed independently. Like nothing can stop you from wanting to hose off a part. It's got to be very effortlessly done. So like on my machine, it's just right here, and I can hose off and then back to grinding.
Cool. So,
the hose really helps you get those holes clean.
Yeah.
And then you can go back to, doing what you need to do to clean the chuck and set up for your next part.
Yeah, the Okamoto has you just loosen up a knob and you could yank the coolant off and then use it as a clean wash down hose. But I never thought of making a little water pistol that goes on it. And I don't have an easy way. I guess I could throw a valve and then turn on the coolant, and then I can have a separate plumbed water pistol.
And I actually have it's a Jupiter Pneumatics air gun that's squirting the coolant, and it's a very small stream, about 6 millimeters, 1/4 inch. But it's because it's such a small, higher pressure stream, it's very good for like squirting out holes. And so you don't need like a ton of flow. You're not using this to like hose down the machine at the end of the day. This is all about getting stuff clean. I don't like using an air pistol with air because it just sends crap everywhere. And I find like kind of working in the confines of the coolant enclosure, hosing out the holes to be relatively low mess, but very effective.
So it's not super high pressure. You're just getting decent flow.
It's a nice stream. Like, you can shoot it across the shop, but
it's good if you have a cat.
And then I'll use that same hose to hose off the chuck and get the bulk of it, and then a quick squeegee gets everything, and then I'm back to cleaning and a stone.
So you've made your opinion pretty clear about air. You're not a big fan of air.
No, I really try not to incorporate it on anything with the grinding machine. I do have one part I do where it's ceramic, and ceramic swarf has an affinity to just kind of stick to everything, especially when it's like really fine grit.
Mm-hmm.
So air was about the only thing I could find to make that happen. But I guess I should elaborate back to needing to get like the bottom of a part with tapped holes so clean. You run the risk when you're inverted and you set it on your chuck. When you drop it, even if you're gentle, it could shake something out of the hole.
Ah, okay.
But that comes back to knowing what a good precision seating feels like. So you drop your part and then give it a scooch or two, and you'll know if something got under the part. But being thorough and cleaning out those holes prevents that from happening.
Now, I will admit that I do use air, and but I respect, your thoughts about that.
I don't even have air plumbed to this side of the shop.
That tells the whole story. So I do use air, and I'm very well aware of the ancient dictum that you do not use air around a grinder. But
there's actually stickers on the Parker warning you not to do that.
Well, the stickers should read "Do not be a bozo," which
precisely. I think you could use it with good judgment. Don't be like cleaning off under the ways or.
Yeah. Let me get the look. There's a little grit on the ways. I'll get it with the high pressure air. I totally agree. So I do use air. We have a few questions. Let's see. Paul Morley asks, "What was that you held up? You said you would put it on your fine pole chuck. So you had a widget that you said I could take this and put it on my chuck if I needed to. Blah. Tell us about your some of the.
No. So I have a standard Walker magnetic chuck, which is kind of like a hybrid pole. It's coarse and fine.
Okay.
But say I'm doing something really thin and I need a true fine pole chuck. I have just a couple different sizes. This is a fine pole Hermann Schmidt.
Could you give us an orthographic view? There we go. Beautiful. And that Hermann Schmidt, how many years does it take to pay that off? Just checking. So that's a little chuck, and it's got a little key, right, to turn the magnet on and off.
One thing I like about Hermann Schmidt chucks is the key is not attached. I think anybody who's worked on a manual chuck has at some point had a spin fixture or dead center set where it's preventing you from turning the handle. It's blocking the handle as you go to rotate it. And so with like a chuck that just takes an Allen key, you can get in there and do what you need to do a lot easier.
Yeah, that's a cute little chuck. Almost says, oh no, we have a couple of questions built in here. Well, let's get Almost. He says, it's been my experience that mist coolant can affect parts more so than, say, mag chuck heat induction or no coolant that is compensated for. Wrong? ? I think the basis of what he's saying is that mist coolant has a big effect, and in fact, mist coolant is a huge refrigerant.
There's an evaporative cooling effect. So I follow the readings of this guy named Dr. Jeffrey Badger, and he posts in Cutting Tool Engineering magazine, and he once referred to minimum quantity lubricant as the future of grinding, and it always will be. People keep trying to inject it into the grinding process, but it never quite delivers on all the promises. And I found that pretty funny. Like, I know some people who use it effectively and are happy with it, but it's still a mess. And if I'm going to deal with a little bit of mess, I might as well just deal with all the mess.
all in. So, we're all in with the mess.
But if you don't have coolant on your machine, or you're just doing light kind of tool room grinding where you're decking off a part here or there, it's effective. So if you need cooling and don't have it, it's certainly easier and cheaper to get into than flood.
Yeah. Also, K-Bonk says, have you found a good quality knockoff non-electric chuck? Basically, he wants a non-electric chuck that isn't a Herman Schmidt.
I like Walker.
Yeah.
I don't. Their new ones are no longer made in the USA, so I guess that's kind of a knockoff.
That makes me sad. Because
Yeah.
Walker, the company, is an hour and a half from here in Worcester, Massachusetts.
At least on their small ones. Maybe they just decided to focus on the big electromagnetic ones in house. But yeah, I don't know. You could find the old Walker Ceramaxes. They have like a cast body painted white. You can find those very reasonably used most of the time. And I have a few kicking around.
I had two flavors.
That would be what I would get.
I had two flavors of Walkers. One ended up so my grinder, my Brown and Sharp, came with a Walker that was a cast aluminum base, and I ended up taking that off, turning it into a backup, and then got another Walker off eBay. They're not super expensive, but the Walkers in general have been very, very solid. Really nice chucks.
I have no complaints with this non-American built Walker. If anything, I kind of like the body is monolithic. It's just like a big block of metal. And so you can stand it on its side really easily if you ever needed to, stuff like that. But yeah, when I spec'd out the machine, I told them to put a Walker chuck on it, and that showed up. And I was like, oh, it's Walker Premium, but it's no longer made in the USA.
Yeah.
So if in the future, if I were to buy that machine again, I would probably get it without a chuck and just find something, on my own.
And the Okamoto came with an Okamoto chuck, which of course they're sourcing from somewhere. But it's been fine. I've had no issues with it. And that's an electric, and that's been okay. So let's see. K-Bonk asks, how about vacuum? So it's a good question. Vacuum work holding on the grinder. Have you ever done it?
For the first time recently, I had to grind 60 G10 samples, customer water jetted, and they were 1/8 inch, and they wanted them ground down to 3 millimeters, which is about 0.1181. So 118 thou tenth. And yeah, I made a small vacuum fixture and had to run a line over from the mill side of the shop to hold them. But I was really impressed with how painless that was. They weren't looking for dead flat, and I told them that something like G10, it's going to have a lot of stress and it's going to curve as you grind it. But they just wanted 2 parallel sides and a nice cohesive thickness, so when they sandwich it down, it acts as an insulating spacer. And I was able to get them that pretty painlessly. And yeah, I was surprised how well G10 ground on the back chuck. So,
Did you make a little vacuum fixture, or was that a purchased chuck?
I made the chuck. And then I bought the vacuum generator kind of deal that Jay Pearson sells, and I was pretty happy with that. So, see if I have.
So while we're on the topic of vacuum, I just want to point out that there are vacuum pumps out there that are inexpensive, and they are designed for air conditioner maintenance guys. And I bought one of those to use in a vacuum truck application, and they will overheat in that application. And I had a failure, not a catastrophic failure, but it basically failed. The vacuum generators, of which you're talking, which is a Venturi that basically takes air pressure and turns another line into a vacuum line, actually work shockingly well. And they use
Just how little air consumption there was. Like I thought my
yeah.
rotary compressor would be running all day, but it really was pretty mild.
It's
So
stunning how efficient it is compared to how efficient you imagined it would be. So
yeah,
if you want to get into the vacuum holding game, do not go the direction of the vacuum pump for AC guys. Do go the direction of the Venturis. And Jay Pearson Workholding, excellent source for that stuff. Good point. WR Rocket says, and I did not forget about you, WR Rocket, with respect to antennas. We'll talk. Does the resin in the G10 try to load up the grinding wheels at all?
I was convinced that was what I was going to be dealing with. And I used a silicon carbide 39C wheel. And yeah, I wasn't getting aggressive with it, but it ground pretty much painlessly.
There you go. What led you to choose the silicon carbide?
I do like a lot of linen-based phenolic resin, and I've always had good luck with silicon carbide on that stuff. And it's just a sharp, somewhat open bond. And so like in that, I'm not looking for like a plowing action that you would get with like a duller aluminum oxide grain. I want the sharpest cutting action possible. And usually that's silicon carbide.
So let's get back to our workflow here. I'm going to actually bounce us a little earlier in the process. We did not talk about, mounting a wheel, balancing a wheel, and putting a wheel on the machine, which is part of the workflow. So let's talk a little bit about that. I obviously have opinions. I know that comes as a shock about wheel balancing and such, but let's talk a little bit about preparation, starting with a new wheel. How do you go about it?
Okay. Ring test. So I'm assuming we're talking about like a sand wheel. See if it's going to explode or not. We're all good there. I'll mount it on the hub.
I don't think I've ever heard it put better or more convincingly that you should do the ring test than what you just said. See if it's going to explode.
I've had 2 wheels explode on me, and it's just really not a good time. And one was on a vertical ID grinder, which is like a rotating table, kind of like a vertical lathe, and then the grinding head. And so the grinding head's like face height. And I really didn't care for that. And then I get it mounted on the hub. I tighten it appropriately, but I find with coolant, as soon as it gets wet, you could almost always get like another cinch out of it. Once those blotter papers get a little moisture in them, like they need just a little more snugging. So usually what I do is like I'll get it on there and I'll rough dress the bottom and sides. And once the blotters have got some wetness on them, I give it one more snug, and then I go in and do finish bottom and side dressing. So when I'm dressing the sides, I'm putting back taper into the sides, making like a dish shape on each side of the wheel.
How much?
That allows me to side wheel. I do a degree on the first half. And then anytime I'm doing redressing of the side, like say I'm dressing slots and going in and redressing, I'll do a half a degree. That way, like the wheel, you're not running up that whole taper each time. It's kind of like a bevel and then a sharpening bevel on a knife. So yeah, I do a degree the first time and then half after that. And so I find by dressing all the way up to the hub, or as close as you can get, you get a lot of variation on thickness removed, and that kind of helps with balance. But typically with sand wheels, I do not balance. The only time I'm balancing are larger super abrasives. So.
Okay. So I balance all the time. And
you're part of the big balancing industry, though.
I am. I'm I'm part of big balancing. Exactly.
You and
I have to.
Marcos.
I'm towing the corporate line here. Unix likes big balancing. I think Unix. I don't know if you know this, but I played bass for big balancing back in the 80s. It's true. Yeah, I'm a big fan of balancing. Of course, with the B200 balancing rings from Kinetic Precision, balancing is easy and fast. You too can balance.
No.
Go.
I think balance. I'm doing things on grinders that most people aren't doing on most grinders. Like I'm running a lot slower wheel speeds most of the time for the work I'm doing, and it's a pretty good grinder in terms of vibration. If I was running like a cheaper, well-used ball-way grinder, I noticed that a ball-way machine can sometimes excite a vibration a little easier than a hydrodynamic machine.
Interesting.
And if it has a fixed 3,600 RPM spindle, that's another issue. I think it's going to jump into a chatter pattern a little more easier than a machine where you can tune all those variables.
So this is a rabbit hole that we don't have time to go down, but I hope we can have you back to go down it. But modern grinders are all VFDs, and we usually can grab a knob and change the wheel speed easily. Whereas older grinders are fixed. And
60 hertz.
60 hertz, baby, and 3,600 RPM, and you are done. And that led to lots of procedures, which today we look at and go, why are we doing that? Like, never, ever turn off your grinder. Well, or your spindle, I should say. Well, why? Because that big jolt you get when you turn it on is going to move the wheel. And you don't get a big jolt on a grinder that has a VFD. It's just going to accelerate nicely. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we have built into our grinding foo from the ancients that didn't have VFDs.
Yeah, that's extremely fair. But I mean, just say you have a borderline amount of imbalance, like it's not quite good enough, but the machine can suppress it at a lower RPM. At 3,600 RPM, it might start to hop on the part. And so, yeah, that's why I really strongly recommend a VFD if you buy a used grinder in your garage, because it can also solve your three-phase issue. You can do single in.
Minor point of time here. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to go long, for which I will not apologize, because we're having a good time and we're going to bring this in for a landing. Let's see. The other thing we should point out, and this is part of the rabbit hole that we don't have time to go down, is that there are resonances, and if you have an imbalance and that imbalance excites a resonance, you're going to see major stuff on the work. You're going to see major evidence of it. Whereas if you're able to go in, this is an expedient fix, and you can tell me if you agree with this, Adam, but if you can go in and just change your wheel speed, you may be able to get away from that resonance and live with it.
Most machines, like, you would know more about this than me, but their natural frequency of resonance is near 60 hertz. So if you have a wheel hopping and the machine likes that, it can excite a little easier. So just being able to kind of break that up. Well,
WR Rocket suggests you just used to have to move. You used to have to move your grinder to Europe to get a lower spindle speed with 50 hertz.
50 hertz.
Hey, Laney Machine Tech is here. Welcome aboard, the other Adam. Can we call you the other Adam? He said VFDs going on both grinders now. Thanks for the tip, guys. You're welcome. And I put a VFD on my Harrig. My very first grinder was a Harrig 612, and I installed a VFD on it. And I have to say, just the slow acceleration and slow deceleration, or controlled acceleration and controlled deceleration, was worth the price of admission. Forget the fact that I had to do two-phase to three-phase conversion anyway. that was a wonderful thing, and totally throws out a bunch of old think.
Back to parameters real quick. We were talking about kind of things we could do to suppress a potential vibration, and one of them is like your step over parameters. Working to non-integers of the wheel width is handy. So if you have a 1/2 inch wheel, don't take a 1/4 inch step over, because that corner is going to kind of track in the same place every time. And then usually you have a different finishing step over than your roughing step over. And your finishing step over should be a non-integer of either of those as well.
Agree. Double thumbs up. If you guys don't understand what Adam just said, get the recording and listen to it 17 times. Very important to not reinforce some sort of input from an imbalance on your work, and that can go a very long way to hide, to improve your surface finish given the parameters you have available.
So normally I'm not a big fan of like a continuous feed, what we'd call like a zigzag path.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For surface grinding, because it's the least time efficient. Going across, stepping over, going across, like, more of a stepped path is going to be your most efficient way to cut the part. But the zigzag is also pretty good for like not allowing those patterns to form. Whereas with a CNC grinder, it can step across very precisely, and you get these very
a little too precisely, actually. That was definitely something I saw going from a manual machine to a CNC machine, is that it's going to do the same thing every pass, and that's actually not good. Excellent point. Carl says, I think Robin Renzetti just put a VFD on a grinder. Yes. So here's a question. Would you ever not put a VFD on a spindle motor going forward in this life? And I think the answer for me is absolutely not. I would always use a VFD.
Yeah, I have not seen any downside to them. So.
Now you had a question about VFDs.
Oh yeah, I'm lathe shopping, and despite having 480 and 243 phase in my shop, I managed to find one that's 380, and it's got 3 motors on it. And I was wondering, have you ever used a single VFD to generate 50 hertz 380 for? Is that allowable to feed 3 separate motors, basically?
So in my experience, a relatively inexpensive VFD is going to allow you to change frequency and create 3-phase from single phase, but it doesn't speak to voltage. So if you need 380,
you got to do that before.
You got to do that before the VFD. So you're either going to use a special transformer to get you to 380, or if you have one of these multi-tap transformers, you may be able to go find the 380 tap simultaneous with your other loads and pull that off.
Oh,
and I know you have a transformer because you have some crazy stuff going on already. You may be able to find your 380 tap and just pull right off of that. So you can go from that into a VFD, and then say to the VFD, make 50 hertz, and you're done.
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with my phase converters, but I'm literally running out of wall space, and so I thought a VFD can usually be pretty compact solution. You might even be able to fit it in the existing electrical panel on the machine, and so I kind of wanted to explore that a little, but we'll see.
Okay, K-Bonk says, pretty sure VFDs are best on one motor, but I don't know. So, and then almost says you don't want to use a single VFD for multiple motors. I'm going to agree and disagree on these. The biggest thing with VFDs is you don't want to put any sort of switching or connectors between the VFD and the motor. So VFD is married to a motor, full stop. You can actually damage a VFD if you have a switch between it and the motor and you start switching things around. Carl says, doesn't a VFD have implicit voltage regulation? It depends how much you paid for it, Carl. That's the problem. So the cheap ones, you're going to spend $150, $200 on a box. It does not have voltage regulation. In fact, what they do is they take your input, they rectify it to DC, and then they chop it and send it out the 3 phases, and that's just switching. So there's no voltage changing. It's just pure switching. So no, the answer is, for the cheap ones, it does not have voltage regulation. But you brought up a question, and this is what K-Bonk was commenting on. You had multiple motors, and if you just wanted to run multiple motors, like in parallel going into a VFD, I am not sure that would work. I can't come up with an argument with why it wouldn't work. However, really a VFD is designed to be looking at one motor. So unless you want to save, you're talking the difference between spending $200 and spending $600, I would put one VFD per motor, full stop. Because they also do overload protection, and it also gives you the opportunity to run the different motors at different frequencies if that's what you wanted to do. So, yeah, that's my philosophy is the VFD is married to a single motor. And you can get them really tiny. Like if you have like a table motor or some sort of small motor, you can get really small VFDs. They'll go down to 8 horsepower.
One's for the feed box and the other's for a lubrication pump. So it's like, those probably don't have a lot of draw on them, but yeah, I don't know.
You could probably run, if you have a bunch of little motors that you don't need to control, I think you can parallel them up and they'll work fine. That's one electrical engineer's opinion.
That's just one of the lathes I was looking at, though. So I don't know. The American lathes always have a soft spot in my heart, so I might end up that direction.
I actually don't think I've ever heard of a 380 power source, so that's very interesting. That it was that an American power source? Okay.
What? Swiss lathe, and then there's a German brand I was looking at as well. That's 380.
Okay.
So.
Well, I shouldn't talk because my Okamoto is 200 volts. That was interesting. WR Rocket says, if you're installing a VFD yourself by putting an EMI filter on the power input can be a good idea, or make sure it has one built in. Yeah, VFDs definitely have the potential of generating EMI, which stands for electromagnetic interference. So if you're a radio guy and a VFD guy, you might have some issues. Paul says, no switch between VFD and motor. I have a manual barrel switch between my grinder motor and my mill motor, which happens to be essentially the same size. I never switch when anything is on. Yeah, you've gotten away with it because you've been careful. But if a day arrives when you're not careful, then I have some semiconductors I want to sell you. So just use extreme caution. But generally, we want to keep them tied together. So we got off the track of workflow a little bit, but it was worth it because guys had questions. So we've mounted a wheel. We've balanced or not balanced a wheel. We've compensated for not balancing the wheel. We've talked about chucking things and de-chucking things. What's next?
Demagnetizing things.
Let's talk about that.
So like if you're going from your first grind to your second grind, or maybe even your third on, you're constantly flipping flat parts. I like to demagnetize it because you kind of get like a false sense of how flat it is when you're putting it on the chuck. Because if it has a little magnetism, it's pulling itself down to the chuck, even when the chuck's off. And so you might do the corner tap, if I'm just rough grinding, I'm not going to take it over to the granite and see how flat it is. I'll just feel if it's flat enough for the roughing stage. And if it's got a little magnetism yet, you can't really tell that when you put it on the chuck. So I like a demagnetizing step thrown in there. And also, it can help if you got swarf stuck to the steel part. It can help it kind of come off. So,
and a demagnetizer, phase one, inexpensive.
I kind of hold my nose up in the air at like some of that stuff, but it works fine.
Works fine.
Horrendous sound, but it's no longer magnetic.
Okay, so guys, here's what a demagnetizer is. So we know what we're talking about. It's a transformer. Imagine a transformer winding, but it's one winding, and the core of the transformer comes around and leaves a gap. So you have this very intense magnetic field that's running at 60 hertz. And then you run your part across it, and when it gets to the real strong part of that gap, the magnetic domains are being flopped around, and as you draw it away from that gap, they land in random positions, and then you're done. So now you've basically randomized all of your magnetic domains. Carl says, it's a choke. Carl, you and I agree, but remember, there's some people here that think a choke is something else. And I'm not going to rag on the jiu-jiteros, but just remember, it means something else. So exactly correct. So that's how a demagnetizer works. And when you're holding a part and you're going across that demagnetizer and you get to that gap, it could be pretty exciting, right? You could feel that thing vibrating in your hand, and it could scare the crap out of you. Here's a tip from me. Get some of that green powder coating masking tape. McMaster-Carr sells it. I'll try to remember to put the part number up. It's 3/1000 of an inch thick and very rugged. Put it across your demagnetizer. So now when you put your part down, you're not putting it on a piece of cheap stainless. You're rubbing it on a piece of plastic. But don't put anything too thick on it, or you're going to lose the benefit of the very strong magnetic field. Anyway, sorry, you got me all excited about demagnetizing. Tux Garage says, how do you keep your precision parts from oxidizing, thus keeping them precision? I use a CRC rust preventative spray, which I like. I think it's 520 is their number. What do you do, Adam?
Keep it dry shop.
No humidity allowed.
No, I mean, I make sure the shop air's dry, but like when I store stuff, I don't, unless it's going away for a long, long time. Like I have some fixtures that come out about once a year. I'll hit with some LPS, but like my kind of use once a week type stuff, it goes in the box dry. So
Tuck asks, even parts you ship to customers?
Parts that are going shipped, they get LPS and VCI paper. But in my journey through this trade, I have discovered some people, when they touch parts, cause them to rust, and others do not. I'm in the lucky camp. I do not have oil acid things going on with my skin. And so
I have a friend.
I absolutely have dealt with people when they touch something bare steel, next day it's got fingerprints on it.
I have a buddy of mine, when he comes over to my shop, he just does this. He doesn't touch anything. I said, what's going on? He says, I rust everything I touch. I said, don't be ridiculous. Well, one day we found out he rusted everything he touched.
Yep.
I don't understand it, but there it is.
So,
Almost Machining
I've heard
says,
a lot of wild theories, but yeah, I've never really known why that is.
Yeah. With respect to the tape put on top of the demagnetizer, Almost Machining suggests Kapton. Yes, perfect. Excellent. So I think we covered that pretty good. So let's see. We've demagnetized parts. Are we at the end of our workflow? We've shipped the parts in VCI paper and LPS.
Yeah, I'd say everything else is just going to be an iteration of what we've established. Like, say you're measuring and going back on. Well, same principles. Clean.
What about end of day? Yeah, Tux Garage says final cleanup? Question mark.
So, as I'm cleaning and washing down the grinder, the wheel's still running, but there's no coolant on it. So I let the wheel fling off for however long it takes me to clean up the grinder, and then I shut her down. So on the manual grinder with no coolant, I just shut it off. Now, oddly, on the Parker Majestics, there's this old wives' tale that the table has to be all the way to the column in order for the lubrication system to work. And what it was is there's a oil port in the table that when the table was all the way back, you could remove a screw and stick an oiler down to put oil on the bronze nut for the lead screw for the table. And that's the only reason it had to be all the way back. But a lot of one-shot systems solved that. But the wives' tale of the table has to be all the way back in order for the lubrication to work stuck around. And it's sad to say, I still put the table all the way back. Because to me, a grinder with the table out, not doing anything, looks a little off.
Yeah.
I usually park the table back by the column, even though I know it's idiocy.
Now, do you use any mist collection?
Yeah, I have a Quattro HEPA filter set up on the manual one. Then the CNC one, I have a hose I could drag over there if I'm doing mist, but I don't get a lot of coolant mist, so the enclosures are pretty high. I would notice if residue or abrasive was coming out of the machine. I would pick it up and notice, but it hasn't been an issue. So
I have a Mist-Fit 550, which is made by AeroX in Toronto, which is I learned about it from Grimsmo, and that sucks up. Big plenum that I designed, and then another hose that goes to the wheel housing, and that sucks up. And the idea is that coolant mist, and when I'm doing stones, there is a lot of it, gets sucked up, it coalesces on these sections, these plates, and then it drips back down. Well, what happens is when you turn off the mist collector, you get a whole bunch of dripping. So when I
Does it come down through the hose that collects through, or is there a separate hose?
Well, actually, there's two places. So it depends how you configure it. I, in fact, configured it the way you're imagining. So there's a tray up there, and it drips onto the tray, and then it goes down this other clear hose, which I have returning to my coolant. But also, coolant will go up into the big air hoses and then kind of stay there, it's kind of being held there. Yeah. When you turn off the airflow, it'll dribble back out, which is totally fine. But you have to know that, because if you're all cleaned up and then you go to turn off the mist collector, all of a sudden it all dribbles down. So the first thing I do is I turn off the mist collector, which starts the dribbling, which is fine. And then I kind of do the same thing you do, clean up with the wheel running for a while. And one thing you have to, I can't emphasize this enough, when you go to clean up, and you could tell me if you agree or disagree with this, Adam, I have a funny feeling I know which it'll be.
Don't run your hand into the wheel when you're wiping the table down.
Exactly. I would recommend that as other than ideal. Now, I've never done it, but I do have a friend who did get a serious injury that way. Okay. So when you're cleaning, your brain is already shutting down. It's like, I finished this long day of grinding. Everything's cool. I'm so happy I made these parts. You have to be very vigilant when that wheel's running, and be very careful.
My number one safety thing is develop the habit of wiping left to right. Never back and forth. You always start at say your table's all the way, your wheel's all the way to park position, and you wipe away from the wheel every single time.
I like that. So that's a win.
Because you get in the habit, like you might be wiping and you just send your hand right into the wheel. So,
Yeah, I guess what I do is I look at the wheel and I start my whatever cleaning or stoning or whatever I'm doing. I'm looking at the wheel. It's like, I see you, I know where you are, and you're not getting my hand. So be super careful, because that's the time of day where you're tired, you're shutting down, you're cleaning up, and you can get a little inattentive. Be super careful about a wheel that's running.
and then,
Go ahead.
and then last thing I do is, unless I'm like going to be hopping right back on it in the morning doing the exact same thing, I usually pull the wheel off the arbor.
Oh,
and put the wheel away. So,
seeing as I am going to be doing the same thing the next day, I generally leave the wheel on. But I like that. That's a good thing to do. Now on my machine, after I do the cleanup that we just talked about, I center the table again, just because I don't have any particular place fore and aft for it. And then I turn off the spindle. So again, it will spin down very slowly, but under control. And I don't like to, it's perfectly healthy to just like kill power to the machine and walk away is actually okay. But I like to tell the VFD to turn the wheel off. It takes, 45 seconds or something to bring it down to 0. And once I see the RPM meter kind of kick down to 0, like the VFD is all done, then I will hit the e-stop, hit the off button, and then kill the disconnect to the power of the system. What's your procedure?
yeah, pretty much. Like once the spindle's off, I hit power off on the control, kill the power at the machine cabinet, and then shut down the transformer.
Excellent. Well, I think we did it. We took the workflow from showing up in the morning and having coffee, as you correctly pointed out.
Yeah.
All the way to...
back to like needing to develop feel for seating parts really precisely. Are you familiar like with gauge R&R studies? Basically, you have multiple people associated with the process, measure 10 parts 10 times, and you're looking for how much human variation amongst all your operators and quality professionals is happening because of feel, basically. You could apply that same concept to seating parts on a grinder. Have first, second, and third shift all seat parts on a grinder and deck them off and see how much variation is happening, not necessarily in size, but in size from one another of those parts, and see how good each of your people are at getting those parts down parallel, and you can develop the skill set that way, controlled. But yeah, I don't know. Talking to process people, sometimes they get annoyed when the answer is you got to be good at your job.
Well, it's a very good point, because the term CNC operator is a term we imagine has less skill associated with it than CNC machinist. And frankly, when there's skill required, and you shouldn't be apologizing for it. Well, I think a lot of the people consuming this particular source of information are one-person shops or small number of person shops. But I could imagine that if you have a large operation, it's desirable to not be super dependent on somebody's feel for a particular process.
And part of the problem is like grinding stuff flat and parallel on a magnetic chuck isn't really a high production means of doing things. So like if we look at like, rotor pumps and stuff like that, stuff that's getting made in huge quantities, automotive components that all need to be flat and parallel, it's probably not being done on a surface grinder. It's probably like a double disc or a fine grinder, and they're hitting both faces simultaneously. And so because the the highest volumes of grinding is not done on a magnet chuck. You just don't have the processes built up like you would like palletizing a CNC 5-axis mill. You know, there's deep industrial knowledge on that subject, but not so much robotically loading parts into a surface grinder. You know, so.
Well, I think we did it, and Adam, I can't thank you enough for coming on and once again and sharing your wisdom. I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from the folks. And if you guys have any further questions, you can find Adam on his YouTube channel, and maybe even pop him. You're still on Instagram, right?
Yeah, I just don't really post much.
All right.
I still have people I chat with on there. So
is it Adam _the _machinist, I think? Or did you fix that?
Good question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'll tell you what, we'll put it in the information.
Yeah, underscores.
Okay, underscores. So it's Adam _the _machinist on Instagram. Awesome. And if you guys have any other questions, let me know. You should go to, for the links to stuff we talked about, pfg.gg/links. If you need to get flat and stay flat, you need some PFG stones. You can go to pfgstones.com, and I promise we will leave you flat. So once again, Adam, thanks so much. If you guys are on Discord, you could stick around for the after party. Everybody, thanks for being here. Carl, you're awesome. Thanks for being here. Almost Machining, I appreciate you being here also in Arizona. Robert Simpson, thanks. Adrian, awesome to see you. I'll get going on that Swiss lathe. I'll get the order in Monday. And let's see, Tux Garage, Unix Carbide, Evils. Who else is on Discord? Blake is on Discord, WR Rocket, and Paul Morley from Windham, New Hampshire, and somewhere what's your town, Adam?
Charlesburg, Ohio.
There you go. This has been PFG Live. Take care, everyone.